Life had always been a game of appearances for Vivian and me. San Francisco's sprawling skyline framed the penthouse we called home, a pristine view that felt as untouchable as our lives seemed to outsiders. But the truth? It was rotting beneath its glossy surface, and I was the last one to realize it. I'm Oliver Grant, CEO of Zenith Systems, a leader in cybersecurity. At 45, I thought I had everything a man could want: a thriving career, wealth, and a wife whose beauty and wit could command a room. Vivian wasn't just my partner. She was my pride. But lately, there'd been an unease I couldn't shake. It started small. Unfamiliar charges appeared on our credit card statements, thousands spent at luxury boutiques and high-end hotels. When I'd question her, she'd wave it off, claiming it was for charity events or gifts for her many social circles. Her answers were always sharp, often turning the tables back on me. "Don't you trust me, Oliver?" she'd ask, her eyes daring me to argue. I didn't push back then. A part of me wanted to believe her, but the cracks were starting to show. Then there was the receipt. Maria, our housekeeper, handed it to me one afternoon. She found it while shredding papers, a stay at the Sterling Suites, the city's most exclusive hotel. It wasn't from a business trip. It wasn't even from a day I'd been away. I pocketed it without a word, thanking her quietly. Something twisted in my gut that day. I started paying attention. Vivian's charity events conveniently lined up with late nights out, and her explanations grew thinner. Security footage of her sneaking out of our building at odd hours confirmed what I was too afraid to admit. She was hiding something, and she wasn't trying very hard to keep it a secret. One evening, she came to me, dressed to kill, asking for my platinum card for another errand. I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in weeks. The silk of her dress caught the light, her diamond earrings glittered, but there was a coldness in her that chilled me to my core. I asked her flat out where she was going. Her answer was quick, practiced, and just vague enough to feel rehearsed. When I hesitated to hand over the card, she snapped. "Don't start acting cheap on me now, Oliver," she said with a sharp laugh, turning on her heel. That was the moment I stopped wondering and started planning. If she thought she could play me for a fool, she was about to learn just how much I'd built my success on outsmarting people like her. I had no proof yet, just suspicions, and those weren't enough for what I had in mind. But one thing was clear. I wasn't letting Vivian take me down without a fight. The next few weeks were a masterclass in patience. I played my role perfectly, a dutiful husband, distracted by work, too busy to notice the cracks widening around me. If Vivian sensed my unease, she didn't show it. She carried on as usual, her life of indulgence and secrecy moving along without interruption. I, on the other hand, had started assembling my arsenal. The receipt from Sterling Suites was my first breadcrumb. I cross-referenced it with her calendar. She'd claimed to be visiting her sister in Napa that weekend. A quick call confirmed what I already suspected. Vivian hadn't set foot in Napa in months. From there, I dove deeper. Late one night, while she slept, I accessed her laptop. As the CEO of a cybersecurity firm, this wasn't a challenge. What I found was illuminating: emails, reservations, and even a second credit card account I hadn't known existed. The card had been used to book spa days, luxury dinners, and trips to exclusive locales I hadn't been invited to. The pieces began falling into place when I stumbled upon the name Victor Wolf. It appeared innocently enough at first, a name on a dinner reservation, a mention in an email about legal advice. But as I dug deeper, the connection grew darker. Victor wasn't just a divorce attorney. He was the divorce attorney. Known for his brutal tactics, he had a reputation for leaving husbands penniless and broken. What chilled me was how casually Vivian referred to him in her emails, like they were partners in some grand scheme. One email was especially damning. "Don't worry, Victor. He's completely in the dark. I'll have everything ready soon. This will be clean." I saved the message, my hands trembling with a mix of rage and resolve. The next morning, I reached out to Marcus, my best friend and an investigative journalist. Marcus had an uncanny ability to dig up dirt where no one else could. I needed him now more than ever. By the end of the week, Marcus had a dossier on Victor Wolf that read like a crime novel. This wasn't his first time pulling a stunt like this. Victor had been involved in at least 3 other cases where wealthy wives conspired to ruin their husbands, siphoning fortunes into hidden accounts while leaving their spouses to pick up the pieces. The pattern was unmistakable, and Vivian was following it to the letter. My heart ached as I pieced it all together. This wasn't just an affair, it was a betrayal on every conceivable level. The woman I'd built a life with was actively plotting to dismantle everything I'd worked for. But two could play this game. I doubled down, hiring a private security team to install cameras throughout the penthouse. I needed irrefutable evidence, not just emails and receipts. Within days, the feeds confirmed my worst fears. Vivian's late-night escapades weren't innocent. She was meeting with Victor regularly, their conversations filled with whispers of plans and next steps. One night, I watched as she retrieved a folder from her hidden safe. The camera caught every detail as she thumbed through forged documents, bank statements, and a script outlining false allegations against me. She was preparing to paint me as an abuser, a narrative designed to win her sympathy in court and cost me everything. The breaking point came one evening when I overheard her on the phone. Her voice was cold, calculating. He's clueless, Victor. Once we're done, he'll be lucky to keep his socks. I felt something snap inside me. I wasn't just going to defend myself, I was going to dismantle the entire web she'd spun. Vivian had made one critical error. She thought I was blind. She'd forgotten who she married. I wasn't going to remind her. Not yet. From the outside, our lives looked like a glossy magazine spread, dinners at five-star restaurants, gala appearances, and weekend retreats to Napa, the one she actually attended. But behind closed doors, the tension was palpable. I had to keep up appearances, to lull Vivian into a false sense of security, while every moment of her betrayal replayed in my mind. I couldn't confront her, not yet. Every instinct screamed at me to demand answers, to expose her lies, but that wouldn't serve the plan. I needed her to feel untouchable, confident that I was the oblivious fool she believed me to be. The surveillance footage kept piling up. Day by day, night by night, the cameras captured the unraveling threads of her deceit. Vivian's movements were precise, her lies rehearsed. Each rendezvous with Victor was carefully timed, her demeanor cool and controlled. One evening, I saw something new. The camera in the living room caught Vivian speaking into her phone, pacing with the kind of nervous energy that only surfaced when she was hiding something big. The transfer needs to happen this week, she hissed. If we wait, the accounts might be flagged. I leaned back in my chair, gripping the armrests. She was moving money, my money, into offshore accounts. The next day, Marcus and I sat in a dimly lit diner, going over the evidence I'd gathered. He pushed his glasses up his nose and tapped the stack of printouts with a pen. Oliver, this is airtight. You've got her dead to rights, he said, his voice low. I nodded, but the weight of it all sat heavy on my chest. It's not just about proving her guilt, I replied. I need to make sure she pays for this, Marcus. Not just legally. Personally. Marcus grinned, a glint of mischief in his eyes. You always were one for the dramatic finish. What's the play? I explained the next phase of the plan, a carefully orchestrated trap. Marcus's journalistic contacts would help me compile a dossier on Victor Wolf's shady dealings, while I would ensure Vivian implicated herself in every move she made. It started small. An innocent question over breakfast. Viv, do you remember when we talked about restructuring our accounts? I've been thinking we need to secure more assets in case of emergencies. She barely looked up from her cappuccino. That's your department, darling, she said dismissively. Just let me know where to sign. I forced a smile. She was good, I had to give her that. But I was better. That afternoon, I arranged a meeting with my legal team and forensic accountants. If Vivian wanted to drain my fortune, she'd have to work for it. By the time she tried to access the accounts again, they'd be locked down tighter than Fort Knox. The real challenge, though, was emotional. I wasn't just dealing with a financial betrayal. I was grieving the woman I thought I knew. Every laugh, every tender moment we'd shared now felt like a lie. But I couldn't let my feelings derail me. One evening, as we sat on the balcony overlooking the bay, she leaned into me, her hand resting lightly on mine. You've been so quiet lately, she said, her tone almost genuine. I turned to her, forcing a soft smile. Just work stress. You know how it is. She nodded, sipping her wine, completely unaware that the man sitting beside her was no longer the husband she thought she could manipulate. The storm was building, and when it hit, she wouldn't see it coming. If Vivian noticed my growing distance, she didn't let on. Maybe she was too wrapped up in her schemes to care. Or maybe she assumed my silence was resignation, a man too preoccupied with work to notice the slow dismantling of his life. Either way, it worked to my advantage. The more I watched, the clearer her arrogance became. She moved through her routine with the confidence of someone who believed they'd already won. It made my job easier. She wasn't bothering to cover her tracks anymore. The security feeds revealed the full extent of her treachery. Vivian was meticulous, spending hours at her desk crafting false narratives, shredding documents, and whispering into her phone late into the night. One afternoon, she met Victor at a cafe downtown. The camera caught snippets of their conversation, just enough to confirm my suspicions. "We're almost there," she said, her voice low but steady. "By the time he realizes what's happening, it'll all be done." Victor nodded, sipping his espresso with a smirk. "Just remember to stick to the script. Judges eat this kind of story up." My stomach turned, but I forced myself to stay focused. Every detail, every word, was another nail in the coffin of their plan. The turning point came on a Thursday night. I was reviewing bank statements in my study, cross-referencing Vivian's offshore accounts with the records I'd managed to pull. That's when I found it, a six-figure withdrawal, transferred to a shell company registered under Victor Wolf's name. Marcus called me as I stared at the screen, his voice crackling through the speaker. "I've got something for you," he said. "Victor's past cases, the ones where the husbands were blindsided? It's worse than we thought." He explained how Victor's clients had all followed a similar pattern. Marry rich, conspire with Victor to drain their spouse's assets, and then disappear once the dust settled. But there was a darker layer to it. Victor wasn't just a lawyer, he was a puppeteer, pulling strings behind the scenes to ruin lives while lining his own pockets. "This guy's a pro," Marcus said. "But he's gotten sloppy. If you want to take him down, now's the time." I thanked him and hung up, my resolve hardening. Victor wasn't just helping Vivian. He was using her. And Vivian? She was willing to destroy me for a shot at freedom, or whatever she thought freedom looked like. The next morning, I hired a private investigator to dig into Vivian's shell companies and Victor's financial ties. The goal wasn't just to protect myself but to unravel their entire operation. By the time I was done, they wouldn't just lose their game, they'd lose everything. But the hardest part wasn't the scheming. It was facing her every day, pretending nothing had changed. Watching her sip coffee at breakfast, her demeanor calm and composed, while I knew what she was planning. One night, as we sat across from each other at dinner, she brought up a charity gala she wanted to attend. "It'll be good for appearances," she said, swirling her wine. "And for you too. You've been so distracted lately." I nodded, forcing a smile. "You're right. A little public engagement wouldn't hurt." Her eyes narrowed slightly, searching my face for cracks. "Is everything okay, Oliver?" she asked, her tone almost sweet. "Of course," I replied smoothly. "Just work as always." She smiled, satisfied, and went back to her meal. But in that moment, I realized something. Vivian wasn't just a liar. She was a stranger. And I wasn't sure which hurt more, the betrayal or the fact that I hadn't seen it coming. Still, I held my ground. The evidence was piling up, and when the time came, I wouldn't just expose her. I'd dismantle everything she'd built on the foundation of our life together. Vivian thought she was playing chess, but the board was mine. Every move she made was leading her closer to checkmate. The gala was Vivian's playground, the perfect stage for her to flaunt her charm and connections. But for me, it was an opportunity. A chance to see how deep her game ran and to push the next phase of my plan into motion. The night was all glitz and glamour, with San Francisco's elite sipping champagne and trading hollow compliments under a canopy of crystal chandeliers. Vivian, of course, was the star of the show. She wore a midnight blue gown that hugged her frame, her diamond necklace glinting under the lights. She worked the room effortlessly, her laugh bright, her presence magnetic. I stayed a step behind, nursing a bourbon and watching her interact. It was almost impressive how easily she could switch from charm to manipulation, depending on who she was speaking with. At one point, I caught her exchanging a knowing glance with Victor, who stood across the room in a crisp suit, his predatory smile barely hidden. Vivian spotted me watching and waved me over. "Darling," she said, her voice dripping with affection, "you must meet Victor Wolf. He's been so helpful with the charity's legal matters." I extended my hand, forcing a polite smile. "Victor, I've heard a lot about you." "Only good things, I hope," he replied, his handshake firm, his eyes studying me. "Of course," I said, holding his gaze just a second too long. "Vivian has nothing but praise for your work." We exchanged pleasantries, the tension palpable. He didn't know it yet, but I was holding all the cards. As the evening progressed, I made sure to stay close, subtly inserting myself into conversations and keeping Vivian within earshot. She was good at hiding her frustration, but I could see the flicker of annoyance in her eyes every time I lingered too long. When the band started playing, I asked her to dance. She hesitated, her gaze darting toward Victor, but eventually relented. On the dance floor, I pulled her close, my voice low. "You've been busy lately." She tilted her head, feigning confusion. "What do you mean?" "Oh, you know. Charity meetings, legal consultations." I let the words hang in the air, watching her closely. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "It's all part of the job, darling. You wouldn't believe how much work goes into these events." "Must be exhausting," I said, my tone light. "But I'm sure it'll all pay off in the end." Her grip tightened on my shoulder, her smile fixed. "It always does." The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I'd planted the seed. She was too smart not to suspect something, and I wanted her on edge. The more confident she was in her control, the harder she'd fall when it crumbled. By the time we got home, she was uncharacteristically quiet. I let her retreat to the bedroom while I poured myself another drink. In the reflection of the window, I caught a glimpse of her walking past, her expression unreadable. The next morning, I put the final phase of my plan into motion. Marcus and I compiled everything. The footage, the bank statements, the emails, and the conversations we'd recorded. It wasn't just evidence, it was a roadmap of her betrayal, every step leading back to her and Victor. I made one last call to my attorney, ensuring every document and piece of footage was admissible in court. Then, I made a second call, to a federal investigator. Vivian thought she was untouchable. She thought she could steal my fortune and my reputation, leaving me with nothing but the ashes of my life. But she'd underestimated the one thing I'd built my success on: knowing my enemy better than they knew themselves. The trap was set, and soon, the world Vivian had so carefully constructed was about to come crashing down. The morning after the gala, Vivian seemed more distant than usual, her carefully constructed facade starting to show cracks. She lingered over her coffee, scrolling through her phone, her expression unreadable. I pretended to focus on the financial reports spread out on the table, but my attention stayed on her, noting every subtle shift in her demeanor. "Long night," she muttered absently, not looking up. "Gala events always are," I replied, keeping my tone light. "You seem to enjoy yourself." She gave a faint smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "It's all part of the job, isn't it? Networking, making the right connections." I nodded, sipping my coffee, and let the silence stretch. She was waiting for me to probe further, to push or pry, but I wasn't giving her the satisfaction. Later that day, I reviewed the previous night's footage from the security cameras. Vivian had slipped out of the bedroom just past midnight, still in her gown. The camera in the living room caught her pacing with her phone pressed to her ear. "You shouldn't have approached us at the gala," she hissed into the phone, her tone sharp. "He's not an idiot, Victor. He notices things." Victor's voice came through faintly from her speakerphone. "Relax. He's distracted with work. We've covered our tracks." Vivian stopped pacing, her free hand gripping the edge of the couch. "I hope you're right. I can't afford for this to fall apart now." Watching the exchange made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay composed. The plan was in motion, and if I reacted now, it could all unravel. By mid-afternoon, Vivian announced she was heading to another charity meeting. She breezed through the penthouse, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her designer bag slung casually over her shoulder. "Don't wait up," she said as she passed me. I glanced up from my laptop, offering a faint smile. "Wouldn't dream of it." As soon as she was gone, I called Marcus. "She's heading out. Can you have your guy follow her? Already on it, Marcus replied. She won't make a move without us knowing. The rest of the afternoon was spent poring over the growing pile of evidence. The offshore accounts alone painted a damning picture. Large sums siphoned from our joint accounts into shadowy corporations under false names. Vivian had even gone so far as to create forged invoices and contracts to justify the transfers. By evening, Marcus called with an update. She met Victor at his office, he said. From what I can tell, they're fine-tuning their strategy. A lot of talk about timelines and keeping you in the dark. Good, I said, my voice steady. Let them think they're ahead. It'll make the fall that much sweeter. When Vivian returned later that night, she acted as if nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day, and even suggested we watch a movie together. A rare gesture these days. I played along, pretending to be the clueless husband she assumed I was. But as we sat on the couch, her head resting lightly on my shoulder, I couldn't shake the bitterness creeping in. Every laugh, every touch, felt like a performance, a rehearsed act to keep me placated while she orchestrated my downfall. The next morning, I met with my attorney to finalize the paperwork. My accounts were locked, my assets secured, and the evidence against Vivian was neatly compiled into a dossier that would make any prosecutor salivate. It's solid, my attorney said, flipping through the pages. When do you want to move on this? Soon, I replied. I just need one more piece to tie it all together. That evening, Vivian slipped up. She left her laptop open in the study while she took a shower, an email draft minimized on the screen. I hesitated for only a moment before opening it. Subject: Next step. Victor, everything is in place. Once the transfer is complete, I'll move forward with filing. He won't know what hit him. I took a screenshot, forwarding it to my email before closing the laptop. When she returned to the study, wrapped in a silk robe, I was sitting at the desk, flipping through a magazine as if I hadn't just uncovered the final nail in her coffin. She smiled at me, leaning against the doorway. You've been working so hard lately. Maybe we should plan a little getaway. Just the two of us. I looked up, returning her smile. That sounds perfect. She thought she had me fooled, that her charm could still disarm me. But the truth? I wasn't the man she married anymore. I was something sharper, colder, a man ready to watch her house of cards collapse. And collapse it would. The days leading up to the showdown were a careful dance of patience and precision. Vivian's confidence seemed to grow with every passing hour, her demeanor light and carefree. She hummed while she prepared her morning coffee, spent her afternoons in elaborate planning sessions for her supposed charity work, and smiled at me as if nothing in the world could touch her. It was almost comical. She had no idea the walls were closing in. Marcus called late one evening as I sat in my study, staring at the dossier laid out in front of me. I've got something you'll want to see, he said, his voice laced with excitement. More dirt on Victor? I asked, leaning back in my chair. Better, Marcus replied. I got a contact at the bank handling her offshore accounts. They confirm she's planning a massive transfer tomorrow morning. If we time it right, we can flag the transaction before it goes through and freeze the account. I allowed myself a small smile. Perfect. What about Victor? He's been busy, Marcus said. Looks like he's prepping for another case. Similar setup to yours. This guy's a serial operator. Then let's make sure he doesn't get the chance to do it again, I said. I'll make the call in the morning. The next day, I set everything into motion. My attorney contacted the bank, ensuring the transfer would be intercepted. Meanwhile, Marcus provided the final pieces of evidence linking Victor to multiple fraudulent schemes. By the time I left for work, the groundwork was laid. Vivian spent the day as she always did, making calls, attending meetings, and moving through the penthouse with the grace of someone who believed she was untouchable. I watched her from the corner of my eye, noting the subtle tension in her movements. She was on edge, likely anticipating the moment her plan would come to fruition. That evening, as we sat down for dinner, she poured herself a glass of wine, her smile brighter than it had been in weeks. You've been in such a good mood lately, she said, her tone almost playful. Work's been productive, I replied evenly. That's good, she said, raising her glass. Here's to more success, for both of us. I clinked my glass against hers, the weight of the moment settling in. This would be the last time we'd sit across from each other like this, pretending everything was fine. The next morning, the trap sprang shut. I was in a conference call when my attorney texted me, "Transfer intercepted. Accounts frozen. It's done." An hour later, Marcus sent an update. "Federal investigators are meeting Victor today. Your evidence was the tipping point." I sat back in my chair, the enormity of the moment sinking in. Months of betrayal, planning, and waiting had led to this. Vivian's empire of deceit was crumbling, and she didn't even know it yet. When I arrived home that evening, the penthouse was eerily quiet. Vivian was in the living room, pacing with her phone pressed to her ear. "What do you mean the account's frozen?" she hissed, her voice sharp and panicked. This wasn't supposed to happen. I stood in the doorway, watching as she scrambled to piece together the fragments of her plan. She turned, noticing me for the first time. Her expression shifted, a mix of surprise and forced composure. "Oliver, you're home early." I stepped into the room, my gaze steady. "I thought we should talk." She hesitated, her phone still clutched in her hand. "About what?" I motioned for her to sit. "About the truth." Her facade cracked then, her confident demeanor faltering. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice shaking ever so slightly. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the dossier, placing it on the coffee table between us. "You've been busy, Vivian." "Too busy." Her eyes darted to the folder, then back to me. "This is ridiculous." I cut her off, my voice cold. "I know everything. The offshore accounts, the forged documents, the meetings with Victor. It's over, Vivian." She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came. Instead, she sank back into the couch, her face pale. "You underestimated me," I continued, my tone unwavering. "You thought I wouldn't notice, that I wouldn't fight back. But you were wrong." For the first time, Vivian was silent. Her carefully constructed world had shattered, and there was no way out. "Federal agents are already investigating Victor," I said. "It's only a matter of time before they come for you." Her eyes widened in panic. You wouldn't." I leaned forward, my gaze piercing. "You did this to yourself, Vivian. You played the game, and you lost." The room fell silent as the weight of my words settled over her. 4 months, she'd thought she was in control. Now, she realized just how wrong she'd been. And I wasn't done yet. Vivian sat frozen on the couch, her hands trembling as she stared at the dossier in front of her. For a woman who had always prided herself on poise, the panic in her eyes was a satisfying shift. But I wasn't here for satisfaction. Not yet. "You're bluffing," she finally managed to say, her voice hollow. "You don't have proof." I leaned back in the chair across from her, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at my lips. "I don't bluff, Vivian. You, of all people, should know that." Her jaw tightened as she grabbed the folder and flipped through its pages. Every receipt, every bank statement, and every email was laid out in painstaking detail. The damning surveillance footage, the late-night meetings, the whispered phone calls, was catalogued and ready for court. "Where did you get this?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "Did you really think I'd let someone take me apart without fighting back?" I asked, my tone calm but sharp. "You thought you could outsmart me, but you forgot who I am." She slammed the folder shut, glaring at me with a mix of rage and desperation. "You have no idea what you've done. You think this makes you the hero? You've ruined everything." "I ruined everything?" I said, my voice rising for the first time. "No, Vivian. That was you. You were the one sneaking around, plotting, and lying. You built this mess brick by brick." She stood abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal. "You don't understand, Oliver. You never understood." "Then enlighten me," I said, folding my arms. "Tell me why you thought it was worth destroying everything we built together." She stopped pacing, her eyes narrowing. "Do you have any idea how suffocating it is to live in your shadow? Always being the CEO's wife, the arm candy, the accessory to your success." I blinked, taken aback by the venom in her words. "So, this was about your ego?" "No," she snapped. "This was about finding a way out. You control everything, Oliver. Our life, our money, even me. I wanted something for myself. Her confession hung in the air, bitter and raw. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. And stealing from me was your solution? I asked, my voice icy. Partnering with a man like Victor Wolf to rip me apart in court? She hesitated, her bravado faltering. Victor promised. Victor promised you the world, I interrupted. But he's already sold you out. The federal agents investigating him? They have everything they need, including your role in his schemes. Her face turned ashen. No, that's not possible. I stood, stepping closer until I was towering over her. It's very possible. He cut a deal to save his own skin, Vivian. And now, you're the one holding the bag. She backed away, her hands shaking. You can't do this. You can't just ruin me. You ruined yourself, I said coldly. I'm just finishing the job. The sound of the doorbell shattered the tense silence. Vivian flinched, her eyes darting to me. That'll be for you, I said, walking toward the door. When I opened it, 2 federal agents stood in the hallway, their expressions stern. Vivian Grant? One of them asked. She's inside, I said, stepping aside. Vivian's cries echoed through the penthouse as the agents approached her, reading her rights. She pleaded, shouting my name, begging me to stop them. But I stood still, arms crossed, watching as the life she'd tried to build on deceit crumbled around her. Oliver, please, she screamed as they cuffed her. You don't have to do this. We can fix this. I met her gaze, my expression unreadable. You taught me one important thing, Vivian. Precision, patience, and knowing when to strike. Her screams faded as the agents escorted her out, leaving me alone in the cavernous silence of the penthouse. For the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of peace. But I wasn't finished. There was still Victor, still the victims of his schemes. If I had learned anything from this ordeal, it was that justice didn't stop with one person. Vivian might have been the face of my betrayal, but she wasn't the only one who needed to pay. The silence in the penthouse was deafening after Vivian was gone. I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the place where she'd crumbled under the weight of her schemes. Her absence felt surreal, but it wasn't a void, it was a relief. The air was lighter, and the space that had once felt like a battleground now felt like my own. But there wasn't time to reflect. Loose ends needed tying up, and the next target in my sights was Victor Wolf. I sat down at my desk, flipping through the evidence Marcus had compiled on Victor. His trail of destruction spanned years. Wealthy husbands left bankrupt, reputations shattered, and fortunes funneled into hidden accounts. He was a parasite, and Vivian was just the latest host he'd latched onto. Marcus called as I was going through the files. Federal agents just left his office, he said, his tone triumphant. They seized everything, computers, files, even his personal phone. Your evidence tipped them over the edge. Good, I replied. But I'm not stopping there. I want his victims to get their lives back. That's going to be tricky, Marcus said. A lot of these guys went underground after Victor destroyed them. They're not exactly eager to revisit what happened. Then I'll find them, I said firmly. He doesn't get to walk away from this without fixing what he broke. Over the next few days, I worked tirelessly. Using Marcus's network and my own resources, I tracked down the men Victor had targeted. Some were hesitant to talk at first, wary of reopening old wounds, but once they realized I wasn't looking for sympathy, just justice, they started to open up. Their stories were eerily similar to mine. A charming wife, a trusted lawyer, and a betrayal so calculated it left them reeling. Victor's fingerprints were all over their downfalls, from forged documents to offshore accounts. With their help, I began piecing together a case so airtight that even Victor's silver tongue wouldn't save him. Meanwhile, the media caught wind of the investigation. Headlines splashed across newspapers and online outlets. Divorce attorney to the elite faces federal charges, and Wolf of Wall Street meets his match. The fallout was swift. Victor's clients abandoned him in droves. His law firm dissolved overnight, and his reputation was left in tatters. But for me, it wasn't enough. One evening, as I sat in my study reviewing the progress, my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something told me to answer. Mr. Grant, the voice on the other end said. It was Victor. I was wondering when you'd call, I replied, my tone icy. I'm not your enemy, he said quickly, desperation creeping into his voice. This was all Vivian's idea. She came to me. I laughed bitterly. You really think that's going to work? I have enough evidence to bury you, Victor. You and I both know this wasn't just her. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. What do you want, Oliver? I want every penny you stole returned to your victims, I said. Every single one. And I want you to make it public. An apology, full transparency, the works. And if I don't, he asked, his bravado wavering. Then I'll make sure the feds keep digging until they find every skeleton in your closet, I said. And trust me, they will. There was a long silence before he sighed. Fine. I'll do it. I hung up, a sense of satisfaction washing over me. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was accountability. As the weeks passed, Vivian's trial loomed closer. Her attorneys tried every trick in the book to lessen her sentence, but the evidence was too damning. The footage of her meetings with Victor, the forged documents, the emails, it all painted a picture of a woman who had stopped at nothing to betray her husband. When the day of the trial finally came, I sat in the courtroom, watching as she took the stand. She looked pale, her once perfect composure replaced with a nervous energy that didn't suit her. Her defense was weak, full of excuses and half-truths, but the prosecution tore it apart. Witness after witness testified against her, from Maria, our housekeeper, to the financial experts who'd uncovered her schemes. In the end, the verdict was inevitable. Guilty. Vivian was sentenced to years in federal prison, and I watched as they led her away, her head hanging low. It wasn't the ending I'd envisioned for us, but it was the one she had chosen. As I walked out of the courthouse, the sun shining brightly overhead, I felt a strange sense of freedom. The life I'd known was over, but a new chapter was beginning. One where I was no longer the victim of betrayal, but the architect of my own future. Victor's victims began to rebuild their lives with the restitution he was forced to provide. And me? I began to find peace, knowing that justice had been served. But there was one thing I hadn't anticipated, a future beyond the wreckage Vivian had left behind. A life where trust and love might be possible again. For now, though, I focused on the simplest truth. I had survived. And that was enough. The weeks after Vivian's sentencing were a whirlwind of loose ends and quiet realizations. The penthouse, once a symbol of everything I'd achieved, now felt like a hollow monument to what had been. It was time to move on, not just from the place, but from the man I'd been. One evening, as I stood on the balcony overlooking the bay, I let myself take in the view for what I knew would be the last time. The city sparkled below, alive with possibility. For the first time in months, the weight pressing on my chest felt lighter. The next morning, I made the call to list the penthouse for sale. The decision wasn't about running away but about making a clean break. I needed a fresh start, somewhere free of the memories that haunted these walls. Marcus visited that afternoon, his usual sharp wit softened by the events of the past few months. He handed me a bottle of my favorite bourbon and clapped me on the shoulder. To new beginnings, he said, raising a glass. To surviving them, I replied with a faint smile. Over the next few weeks, I focused on rebuilding. I threw myself into work, not out of necessity but because I wanted to create something new, something mine. Zenith Systems had always been my passion, and now it became a sanctuary. But it wasn't all work. Slowly, I started reconnecting with the parts of life I'd neglected. Old friends, long-abandoned hobbies, even simple pleasures like walking through the park or reading a book by the fire. One afternoon, while browsing a local bookstore, I met someone unexpected. She was there with her daughter, a bright-eyed 6-year-old who darted through the aisles with a boundless energy that reminded me of the joy I'd forgotten existed. Her name was Emma, and she was nothing like Vivian. Where Vivian had been polished and sharp-edged, Emma was warm and genuine, her laughter infectious and her kindness effortless. We started with casual conversations over coffee, then dinners, then late-night talks that stretched into the early hours. She knew my story, at least the broad strokes of it, but never pushed for more than I was willing to share. With her, I felt something I hadn't in years. Hope. The legal mess with Victor and his victims came to a quiet conclusion. Restitution payments were made, lives began to rebuild, and Victor Wolf disappeared into obscurity, a shadow of the man who had once wielded so much power. As for Vivian, I heard snippets from time to time, a mention in the news, a letter forwarded from her attorney asking for forgiveness. I never responded. Some bridges weren't meant to be rebuilt. On a crisp fall morning, as I stood in the middle of a quiet park, watching Emma's daughter feed ducks by the pond, I realized something. The betrayal, the pain, the anger, they hadn't defined me. They had forged me. Emma walked up beside me, her smile soft and knowing. "You look deep in thought," she said, slipping her hand into mine. "Just thinking about how far I've come," I replied. She squeezed my hand, her warmth grounding me. Sometimes the hardest endings bring the best beginnings. And she was right. For all that I had lost, I had gained something far more valuable. A second chance. A chance to rebuild, to love, to live fully again. As we walked away from the pond, hand in hand, I looked back one last time, not at the past, but at the man I'd become. And for the first time in a long while, I felt whole.